Alexander Cole froze in the center of the hallway, his hand hovering over his gun safe. For 730 agonizing days, his mansion had been a tomb of silence, ever since the trauma that stole his son's voice. But tonight, returning 3 hours early from a collapsed merger, he heard the impossible, a rhythmic, deliberate tapping coming from the locked library, followed by the terrifying sound of his mute son laughing. Adrenaline flooded his veins. He didn't call out. He crept toward the door, expecting an intruder, but when he pushed the heavy oak panels open, the weapon slipped from his sweaty palm. The waitress he'd hired on a whim wasn't dusting the furniture. She was standing at the floor-to-ceiling bay window, her hand moving in a blur as she covered the glass in military-grade encryption algorithms. The exact code Alexander's billion-dollar R&D team had failed to crack for 6 months. And she wasn't alone. His son was standing on a chair beside her, clutching a red marker, finishing her equation. Alexander watched in paralyzed horror as the woman he thought served pancakes for a living turned around, revealing a secret that threatened to shatter his entire reality. Who had he actually let into his house? "Hi, my beautiful family. Thank you for sticking around with me through our trying times. I really appreciate your love and support. We're finally back again to give you many more beautiful stories. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Alexander Cole didn't build a billion-dollar tech empire by being sentimental. He built it by being precise. He treated life like a circuit board: input, output, result. But precision couldn't fix his 10-year-old son, Rodney. Since Helena died 2 years ago, Rodney hadn't spoken a single word. Not one. Alexander had hired the best therapists in Geneva, the best child psychologists in New York. They all said the same thing: trauma-induced selective mutism. The boy was a ghost in his own house, and Alexander, terrified of his own failure as a father, had buried himself in work to avoid the silence. Then there was Laurel. She wasn't a specialist. She was a waitress at the Midnight Diner on 5th Street, a woman with frayed cuffs on her uniform and tired eyes that still managed to smile. Alexander only hired her as a temporary nanny, because she was the only person Rodney didn't flinch away from when they stopped for a quick breakfast. She needed the cash desperately. He needed a warm body to ensure Rodney didn't starve while he prepared for the Tokyo merger. He didn't care about her background. He didn't check her references beyond a criminal background check. To him, she was a transaction, a paid service to keep the boy alive while he kept the empire alive. But tonight, the Tokyo deal collapsed. Alexander walked into his foyer at 8:00 p.m. Not midnight, his mood darker than a storm cloud. He loosened his tie, dreading the oppressive quiet that usually greeted him. He expected the house to be asleep. He expected the coldness. Instead, he heard a sound that froze his blood. It wasn't just laughter. It was a rhythm, a deliberate, complex tapping coming from the library. Before we step into this mansion of secrets, ask yourself, have you ever judged someone's intelligence or worth just by their job title? Let us know in the comments below. Alexander moved toward the library, his expensive Italian loafers making no sound on the runner. He pushed the door open, ready to fire the woman for throwing a party or letting Rodney watch TV too loud. But the words died in his throat. The library was dim, lit only by the street lamps outside filtering through the massive bay window. Laurel wasn't sitting on the couch. She was standing at the glass, a dry erase marker in her hand. And the window? The window was covered in writing. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't cartoons. It was code. Complex, elegant, high-level algorithms that Alexander recognized instantly. It was the specific encryption sequence his own engineering team had been failing to crack for 6 months. And Rodney? The boy who hadn't made a sound in 2 years was standing on a chair next to her, clutching a red marker. His small hand moved furiously, adding a closing bracket to a function Laurel had started. He wasn't just copying her, he was answering her. Laurel whispered, her voice soft but fierce. "See, Rod? The logic gate has to close before the loop repeats. It's like breathing. In, out." Rodney tapped the glass 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythm. Laurel tapped back twice. Tap, tap. Alexander felt the floor tilt beneath him. This waitress, this woman he thought was barely qualified to make a sandwich, was teaching his mute son graduate-level computer science, and his son was understanding it. "Impossible," Alexander breathed, the briefcase slipping from his numb fingers and hitting the floor with a deafening thud. Laurel spun around, her face draining of color. The magic in the room evaporated instantly, replaced by the suffocating weight of Alexander's presence. Rodney didn't look at his father. He dropped the red marker and scrambled off the chair, retreating behind Laurel's legs, burying his face in the fabric of her apron. That simple gesture, seeking safety with her instead of him, hit Alexander harder than the collapsed Tokyo deal ever could. "Get away from him!" Alexander barked, the words coming out harsher than he intended, driven by a cocktail of shock and jealousy. Laurel stepped back, trembling, but she didn't move away from the boy. She grabbed a cleaning rag from her pocket and frantically began wiping the glass, erasing the genius equations with desperate strokes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. I'm so sorry. It's just a game. Scribbles. I'll clean it up." "Stop!" Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides, catching her wrist before she could erase the last line of code. His grip was tight, desperate. "Don't insult my intelligence. That isn't a game. That's a recursive algorithm for a neural network. That is proprietary data. Where did you steal it?" "I didn't steal anything," Laurel's voice cracked, pulling her arm free. She looked small, cornered, her worn waitress uniform suddenly looking ridiculous against the backdrop of high-stakes corporate accusations. "I saw the papers on your desk this morning. I was trying to show him how the logic flows. He likes the logic. It calms him." "You're a waitress, Laurel. You serve pancakes at a diner," Alexander sneered, his fear masking itself as arrogance. He needed to make sense of this anomaly. "You don't teach a 10-year-old mute boy doctoral-level coding. Maybe if you stopped treating him like a broken hard drive and started treating him like a person, you'd know what he's capable of," Laurel shouted back, her eyes flashing with sudden fire before she clamped a hand over her mouth, realizing what she'd said. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stared at her, his chest heaving. He should fire her. He should throw her out. But he looked at the smeared ink on the glass, then at his son peeking out from behind her skirt, with wide, terrified eyes. He couldn't. "My study, now," Alexander commanded, his voice ice-cold. "Explain yourself, or I call the police." Alexander paced the length of his study, the rhythmic clack of his shoes against the hardwood acting as a metronome for his rising agitation. Outside, a sudden autumn storm hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, sealing the mansion in a cage of rain and thunder. The power flickered, then died, plunging the room into darkness before the emergency amber lights hummed to life, casting long, eerie shadows. "Sit," Alexander commanded, pointing to the leather wingback chair. Laurel obeyed, not because she was afraid of him, but because Rodney was clinging to her forearm with a grip so tight his knuckles were white. The boy was trembling. If she pulled away now, he would shatter. "I need to get home," Laurel whispered, glancing at the clock. "My shift at the diner starts at 5 a.m. If I don't sleep—" "You aren't going anywhere," Alexander cut in, pouring himself a scotch with a steady hand. He didn't offer her one. "The road to the main gate is flooded, and even if it wasn't, you don't walk out of here until you explain how you know that algorithm. That code is worth billions. Is it corporate espionage? Did my competitors send you?" "Competitors?" Laurel let out a dry, incredulous laugh. She looked down at her stained sneakers. "Mr. Cole, look at me. I live in a studio apartment the size of this desk. I take the bus. I eat leftovers. If I were a corporate spy, I'd be the worst one in history." "Then explain the math," Alexander pressed, leaning against his desk, invading her personal space. The amber light caught the hollows under her eyes. Rodney looked up at his father, then back to Laurel. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the red marker. He uncapped it, and on the expensive leather armrest of the chair, he drew a small symbol, a question mark inside a heart. Laurel covered the drawing with her hand gently. "Because I wasn't always a waitress, Alexander. And your son, he isn't broken. He's just speaking a language you stopped listening to." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the static of unsaid things. They were trapped by the storm, by the accusation, and by the silent boy acting as the bridge between their two colliding worlds. Alexander sat down slowly, the Scotch glass forgotten in his hand. The arrogance drained out of his posture, leaving a man who looked suddenly older than his 35 years. "You were fixing a bug?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur. Laurel took a deep breath, smoothing the wrinkled fabric of her uniform. "I wasn't always a waitress, Mr. Cole. 4 years ago, I was a doctoral candidate at MIT, computational neuroscience. I was top of my class. I didn't drop out because I failed. I dropped out because my mother got early-onset Alzheimer's." She looked down at her hands, hands that scrubbed tables and carried heavy trays. The state care facility was a nightmare. A private one cost $6,000 a month. The university stipend didn't cover it. Waiting tables, double shifts, tips, night work did. I traded my degree for her dignity. I'd do it again. Alexander looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the intelligence masking the fatigue. He saw the sacrifice etched into the lines around her eyes. "The code on the window," he said, his voice rough. "Do you know what it is?" "It's a prediction model," Laurel said, "for chaotic systems. It's beautiful." "It was Helena's," Alexander whispered, the name tasting like ash. "My wife. She was writing it when the car crashed. It was the last thing she worked on. For 2 years, my entire R&D team hasn't been able to make it run. They said it was fundamentally broken." "It wasn't broken," Laurel said softly, looking at Rodney, who was now asleep against her knee, his small hand gripping her apron strings. "It was just unfinished, like a sentence someone forgot to put a period on." Rodney saw that, He saw the pattern missing. I just gave him the marker. The truth hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Alexander had spent millions trying to preserve his wife's memory through cold technology, treating his son like a damaged byproduct of that tragedy. Meanwhile, a waitress with a mountain of debt had walked in, seen the logic in the chaos, and connected with the boy through the very language Alexander had been too afraid to speak. She hadn't just fixed the code. She had found the exit condition for their grief. The storm outside is nothing compared to the storm inside. If you've ever had to give up a dream for someone you love, type sacrifice in the comments. We see you. The storm outside raged on, but inside the study, the air had shifted from hostile to something fragile and rare. Alexander stood up, walked over to the wet bar and poured a second glass of scotch. He didn't slide it across the desk. He walked around and handed it to her. I can't pay you what you're worth, he said quietly, sitting on the edge of the desk, discarding the barrier between them. Not for the cleaning, for seeing him. Laurel took the glass, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through the room that had nothing to do with the electricity coming back on. He sees you too, Alexander. He just waits for you to stop looking at your phone. Rodney stirred, rubbing his eyes. He saw the laptop open on the desk, the digital rendering of the algorithm on the window. He scrambled off the chair and climbed onto his father's lap. For 2 years, Alexander would have stiffened. He would have called a nanny. But tonight, guided by the woman sitting across from him, he stayed still. He let his son settle against his chest. Rodney reached out, tapping the enter key. The screen flooded with data streams, correcting themselves in real time. He solved the logic loop, Alexander whispered, watching the screen in awe. Helena's legacy. He saved it. He is her legacy, Laurel corrected gently. For the next hour, titles didn't matter. The billionaire and the waitress sat side by side, illuminated by the glow of the monitor, translating the silence of a grieving boy into the language of the future. They laughed when Rodney triumphantly deleted a redundant line of code Alexander had written months ago. For the first time in years, the house felt like a home, not a museum. Alexander looked at Laurel, her messy bun, the smudge of ink on her cheek, the kindness radiating from her, and felt a terrifying hope take root in his chest. He wasn't just grateful. He was captivated. The morning sun didn't bring warmth. It brought reality crashing back in with the force of a sledgehammer. Alexander woke up on the leather sofa, a blanket thrown over him. Laurel's doing. For a fleeting moment, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. The code was compiling on the screen. The impossible problem was solved. Then the library doors swung open. It wasn't Laurel. It was Vance, his head of corporate security, holding a tablet with a grim expression. "Sir," Vance said, his voice clipping the peaceful silence, "we finished the deep dive background check you requested last week. You need to see this." Alexander rubbed his eyes, the pleasant fog of the previous night evaporating. "Not now." "Vance?" "Now, sir. It's regarding the leak." Vance thrust the tablet into his hands. The screen showed grainy surveillance photos from 3 days ago. Laurel. She was sitting on a park bench, looking desperate, handing a thick envelope to a man. Alexander recognized the man instantly. Julian Thorne, his biggest competitor. The man who had been trying to hostile take over Alexander's company for a decade. The air left Alexander's lungs. The math, the connection with Rodney, the vulnerability. It all realigned in his mind, into a sinister, calculated pattern. She wasn't a hidden genius saving his family. She was a mole selling his secrets to Thorne to pay off her debts. When Laurel walked in a moment later, carrying a tray of breakfast, smiling shyly, she didn't see the man she had bonded with. She saw the billionaire tyrant return. "How much did Thorne pay you?" Alexander asked, his voice dead. Laurel froze. "What?" "The algorithm." Alexander stood up, looming over her. "You fixed it so you could steal it. Was the sick mother story a lie too? Just part of the pitch?" "No!" Laurel dropped the tray. Orange juice shattered across the hardwood. "Alexander, I met Thorne to beg for a loan extension. He bought my mother's debt from the nursing home. I was paying him interest, not selling secrets." "I don't believe you," Alexander spat, his old armor locking back into place. He pulled a checkbook from his jacket, scribbled a number with too many zeros, and threw it at her feet. "Take it, pay your debt, and get out of my house. If I ever see you near my son again, I will destroy you." Laurel looked at the check, then at Alexander's cold, dead eyes. She didn't pick it up. She turned and ran, the heavy mahogany doors slamming shut with a finality that shook the house. Upstairs, unnoticed in the chaos, Rodney stood at the railing, watching his world fracture all over again. The silence in the mansion was different now. It wasn't the empty silence of before. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a mistake that couldn't be undone. Alexander sat in his study, the completed algorithm pulsing on his screen. A billion-dollar victory that felt like ash in his mouth. He looked at the check lying on the floor where he had thrown it. She hadn't touched it. A corporate spy would have taken the money. A liar would have tried to negotiate. Laurel had just looked at him with eyes full of shattered dignity and walked away. A small sound came from the doorway. Rodney stood there, holding his backpack. He walked over to his father and placed a crumpled piece of paper on the desk. It was a receipt from a pawn shop, dated 3 days ago. Item, vintage locket. Value, $500. Alexander stared at it. The pieces didn't fit. If she was selling secrets to Julian Thorne, why was she pawning jewelry for pocket change? Alexander grabbed his phone and dialed Thorne's private number. His hand shook, not from fear, but from a dawning, terrible realization. "Thorne," Alexander rasped when the line clicked open. "The meeting with my employee. What did she sell you?" Thorne's laugh was dry and cruel. "Sell me, Cole. Your little waitress didn't sell me anything. She gave me $500. Interest payment on her mother's care debt. I told her it wasn't enough, so I'm moving the old lady to a state ward tomorrow." "Wynham, did you think she was corporate espionage? You always were paranoid." The line went dead. Alexander dropped the phone. The room spun. There was no betrayal. There was no plot. There was just a daughter selling her only heirloom to keep her mother safe, and a billionaire who had been too damaged by his own past to recognize loyalty when it was standing right in front of him. He had accused the only person who had reached his son of treachery, all because he was too afraid to trust again. He looked at Rodney. The boy wasn't looking at the floor anymore. He was looking at the door, waiting. "Get your coat," Alexander said, his voice cracking. "We're going to get her back." The midnight diner was nearly empty at 5 a.m., smelling of stale coffee and rain. Laurel stood behind the counter, her eyes swollen, automatically wiping down the laminate surface. She had lost her dignity, her hope, and likely her mother's care facility, all in one night. The bell above the door jingled. Laurel didn't look up. "We're closed for cleaning," she murmured. "We're not here for pancakes," a deep voice replied. Laurel's head snapped up. Alexander stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, holding Rodney's hand. He didn't look like a billionaire titan of industry. He looked like a man who had run through a storm. "Alexander," she breathed, gripping the counter. "Please, I can't do this again." Alexander walked forward, ignoring the wet floor. He didn't pull out a checkbook this time. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the red dry erase marker, the one Rodney had used on the library window. He walked over to the diner's front window, steaming with condensation from the cold rain outside. With a trembling hand, Alexander began to write. But he didn't write code. He didn't write a contract. He wrote trust equals vulnerability, fear. Waitress. Love. He capped the marker and turned to her. "I spent my life trying to solve the equation of success, Laurel. I thought it was about minimizing risk. But tonight, when I looked at the empty space where you stood, I realized I'd just been dividing by zero. I was undefined without you." Laurel walked out from behind the counter, tears spilling over. "Alexander, I have nothing to give you. I have debt. I have baggage." "You have the answer," Alexander whispered, stepping close enough to smell the rain on his coat. "You fixed my code. You fixed my son. Now let me fix your world. I bought the nursing home, Laurel Tree. Your mother isn't going anywhere, and neither are you. Come home, not as a nanny, as whatever you want to be. Just be there." Laurel looked at him, stunned, but her gaze shifted down to Rodney. The boy tugged on her apron string, just like he had in the study. He looked up, his eyes clear and focused. He opened his mouth, his lips parting to form a shape he hadn't used in 2 years. The diner went silent. "Stay," Rodney whispered. The word was small, but it hit the room with the force of a sonic boom. Laurel dropped to her knees, sobbing, and pulled the boy into her arms. Alexander knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both. The waitress who knew calculus, and the son who found his voice. They sat there on the diner floor, a messy, illogical, beautiful variable in a world of cold constants. Alexander looked at the equation on the window. He finally understood. Some problems aren't solved with logic. They're solved with love. Alexander Cole spent his entire life believing that the world was made of cold, hard numbers. He thought that if he couldn't calculate it, it didn't exist. But, in the end, it wasn't a complex algorithm or a billion-dollar merger that saved him. It was a waitress with a red marker, a little boy who finally found his voice, and a simple truth that no computer can simulate. You cannot solve the problem of loneliness with money. You can only solve it with presence. Sometimes, the smartest person in the room isn't the one in the suit. It's the one serving the coffee. And sometimes, the most important words aren't the ones spoken in a boardroom, but the quiet whisper of a child saying, "Stay." If this story reminded you that love is the only variable that truly matters, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And we want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged by your appearance or job title only to prove them wrong? Or have you ever met a Laurel, someone whose brilliance was hidden in plain sight? Let us know in the comments below. Type true wealth if you believe that people are worth more than their paychecks. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that touches the soul. Until next time, remember, life is not about the figures in your bank account, but the faces around your table.